All videos, sites, and podcasts referenced here will be linked in the description. Over the last decade, the free flow of information that is the internet has beaten back modern apologists to an embarrassing degree on the fronts of empirical evidence, scientific data, and biblical exposure, showing the Bible for the illogical, self-contradictory hodgepodge of ancient stories that it is. Modern apologists have conceded so much ground on those fields that many have abandoned them completely as grounds for argument. Some modern apologists, such as Eric Hovind, Ken Hovind's son, and Cy Bruggencate, who runs the website ProofGodExists.org, have retreated to a ground of debate so desperate and revolting that they should be embarrassed by its premise alone. It's called the presupposition argument. After participating in an informal debate with the two aforementioned apologists, YouTuber Concordance posted a video explaining why the semantic-driven points side tries to make are utterly self-contradictory, but I'll try to break down this argument in simpler terms. Though too absurd to ever convert a non-believer into believing, these word games can be confusing enough to make closeted atheists and fence-sitting Christians keep their mouths shut instead of openly and critically evaluating their positions of faith. As the name implies, the presupposition argument presupposes that God exists. If you're going to presuppose that and consider yourself right no matter what, there isn't much arguing to do. Of course, that's not the end of it, because it's designed to be pressed and to prey on a non-believer's willingness to admit that not all of his or her knowledge is absolute. Of course, admitting that there are things we could be wrong about is the humble position that allows us to advance our knowledge by being open-minded to new information. As you can see in Hovind's interview with YouTuber Thunderfoot, when atheists say, "I don't know everything," the presup arguers accuse them of admitting that they don't know anything. There's a huge difference between not knowing everything and not knowing anything, but that's just a rust on the rails of this train wreck argument. They're also quick to proudly dismiss anyone that acknowledges that our universe existing as we know it is a base assumption. An honest person is willing to admit that under the hypothetical scenario that we are plugged into a matrix or having our minds controlled, that we wouldn't know it, being that it's non-testable. As soon as someone admits that, all of his or her arguments are completely and obnoxiously dismissed by these apologists on the grounds that someone can't make any knowledge claims if they aren't 100% certain about their own existence. Just as they mistake not knowing everything for not knowing anything, they also mistake a person entertaining a non-falsifiable hypothetical scenario with that person claiming that scenario as his or her worldview. I'm willing to conclude that those two misrepresentations are done as dishonest rhetorical devices rather than honest mistakes. For the record, whether or not one has absolute certainty about the nature of existence is irrelevant. It should also be noted that pretending that you have absolute knowledge when those disagreeing with you admit that they could be wrong does not substitute proving them wrong about anything. Of course, they claim to hold absolute certainty and that their existence is as they perceive it to be because they believe in God, who they claim is logic. When asked how they can know they aren't being deceived in the same kind of extreme hypothetical scenario or even being deceived by this God character, they constantly bellow back, because God reveals things to us such that we can be certain. When pressed on how such things are revealed, I've only heard Cy say God reveals it in many ways, but one way is through his word in Scripture. They believe they've avoided circular logic because they've said that they get their reasoning from God, who tells it to them from the Bible, which must be true because their God said it's true. In the Bible. They're happy to accuse anyone who reasons otherwise to be incapable of doing so because their authority comes from their own reasoning rather than from a book. They also attempt to dismiss non-believers with divisive word games, like asking how they know their reasoning is right. Of course, the best way to validate your reasoning is to test it in various contexts to determine whether you've reasoned correctly or not. They equate that to circular reasoning and again are quick to claim victory and run away. Unfortunately for their argument, our reasoning doesn't need to be absolute to be effective. I don't have to know that my logic and reasoning will always be right in order to rely on them. In fact, if I believed that my ability to reason was absolutely perfect, I'd never need to test it or consider the dissension that can extend my knowledge by challenging my presuppositions. It's they who prefer to claim that because they believe in God and read Scripture that they receive absolute logical authority and claim the intellectual high ground without bothering to prove that their God exists in the first place. When pressed to prove their God exists, they refuse because they know it can't be proven. Honest theists admit that, and further admit relying on faith to fuel their beliefs. That isn't logical, but it's a hell of a lot more honest than the likes of Hovind and Bruggencate. What they do when asked for evidence of their God is say things like, evidence in the secular world is only used in trial, and they aren't going to supply evidence for God and let non-believers be his judge and jury. That's not our place. One does have to wonder how well that would hold up in court. Of course, we do know some things are absolute, such as 1 + 1 always equaling 2. If one knows this, he or she is comfortable in saying that, well, we could be wrong about many things, there are some things we can't be wrong about. When this is pointed out to them, their argument claims that the only way those absolutes can exist is if God governs them to exist. As I mentioned earlier, Cy and Eric, at least during the course of their rhetoric, define God as logic and love and all good and so forth. You didn't hear wrong. Cy defines God as logic. His reasoning is that logic is universal, immaterial, and unchanging, which are also traits ascribed biblically to God. Apparently, by his logic, God and ice cream must be the same thing, because I consider both of them to be food, calorically substantial, and delicious. Defining God into something synonymous with logic in an attempt to smuggle logic onto their side is a slimy and unconvincing tactic. What's worse is they offer no explanation for how they make the jump from the pantheistic definitions they offer for God, God is logic and God is love, logic and love exist, so God must exist, to any variety of proof for the Christian God's existence. As absurd as it is to propose that God exists in an effort to prove his existence, and to say that they know they're right because God's book about God that men wrote reveals it to them in a way they can be certain, their argument still goes one step further into absurdity. They claim persistently that this God they have presupposed into existence is something that all people know exists, including the atheists who by definition don't believe it exists. When interviewed on the Thinking Atheist podcast, Cy insisted that atheists who don't believe in God are really just suffering from personal and or psychological issues that prevent them from admitting they believe in God. Perhaps they just want to be God themselves. How easy a lawyer's job would be if all that was needed was to step into a courtroom and inform the skeptical judge and jury that they know the client is innocent, and if they don't know that, they're suffering from some psychological or personal ailments. Again, you have to wonder how many cases an attorney would win with that kind of argument. At this point, the absurdity of their claims should be painfully evident, and time after time they have had simple analogies drawn for them to show the special pleading and cognitive dissonance that their argument requires of them. It was proposed to them multiple times by Thunderfoot that all of their claims about God were true for what he symbolically called the ghost that never lies. It's an analogy that anyone can make using anything so long as it's granted the same attributes they grant their God without a scrap of evidence for it. Time and time again, rather than explaining the distinction between their arguments for the Christian God and his arguments for the perpetually honest ghost, they simply exulted that Thunderfoot was abandoning atheism in favor for what was clearly an analogy. This evasive and intellectually dishonest tactic is the straw man that breaks the apologist's back as being at all willing to actually provide evidence for claims or even attempt to understand the non-believer's position, let alone validate their personal arguments. They should be ashamed of themselves for their intellectual dishonesty, and anyone who hears them peddling it should be eager to inform them of that.